Landon Lecture series of public issues here at Kansas State University. Dr. Heller is one of the nation's most prominent economists. He's been economic advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. He's president of the American Economic Association and currently a member of a Blue Ribbon Committee of experts reviewing the country's petroleum reserves. The topic of his address, the energy crisis and the economy. Dr. Walter Heller.
I'm honored to be your Alfred M. Landon Lecturer this morning, and I'm doubly honored to have Governor Landon in attendance. The election in which he ran for the presidency stands vividly in my mind since it was the first election in which I was old enough to vote. And Governor, I refuse to say for whom I voted on grounds that I might tend to incriminate myself. But let me say this, if there were a vote for position of elder statesman, the qualifications for which are grace and wisdom and perspective, you'd have my vote any day. I'm also honored and humbled by President McCain's introduction, both for what he did say and for what he didn't say. I want to refer to a couple of things he didn't say. One is that I'm now on Bill Simon's FEO Economic Advisory Panel. And I just want to address two comments to that, since I'm talking about the energy crunch and the economy. I guess I have to call it the energy problem and the economy because the President has taken it out of the category of crisis and said it's only a problem now, and so he's revised the title of this lecture inadvertently. But you know, in public, a good deal is made of the fact that I'm a member of Mr. Simon's Economic Advisory Panel, and I should indicate that when I meet with that panel, I find that it's great to be among friends, even if they're not my own. And the other comment is that reports of the life or liveliness of this committee are much like those erstwhile reports of Mark Twain's death, greatly exaggerated. It's had one meeting on January 11th. By the way, it was a very constructive exchange, and I must say both Bill Simon, and John Sawhill, his deputy, were very impressive. It was an excellent meeting, but that was almost 10 weeks ago, and we haven't heard another peep about another meeting. And maybe that's if that committee met more often, perhaps they'd make less mistakes. I think they have a very tough row to hoe, and they probably, with a short-handed staff, simply haven't had time to call the other meetings. But it does raise the question whether it's a public relations ploy or whether they really are turning over a new fig leaf. Now. I wanted to put it in the most felicitous way, as you can see. The other thing I appreciated you didn't say, President McCain, was I'm put in mind of by the introduction that was given to Arthur Okun, who was President Johnson's last economic advisor. When he went up in the 1972 campaign, mind you, to Wall Street to defend presidential candidate McGovern's economics. Now that took courage, to go to the heart of Wall Street. And he was talking to the New York Society for Security Analysts. And you said something in passing that I perhaps needed no introduction. When the man who got up to introduce him before the security analysts started out, he made a classic Freudian slip. He said, "We're going to hear today from Arthur Okun, who deserves no introduction." And I want you to know I appreciate that you didn't do that to me. Of course, that was during the campaign when you had to keep not just an eye but an ear cocked on the candidates. I moderated a debate in Minnesota between a couple of Democratic candidates for office, and I was just amazed to hear one of them say to the other, he shook his finger at him, he says, "The trouble with you is you're failing to develop a meaningless solution." And that's the kind you should fail at. Then I want to remain bipartisan. The Republican Assistant Secretary of Commerce, making a campaign speech, assured his audience that land transportation stops at the water's edge. Now, There's a profound observation, and certainly that's one of the statements out of the Nixon administration that can't be challenged. Now, but again, to maintain the bipartisan perspective, I thought you'd like to know what was said at a Jefferson-Jackson Day dinner in Indianapolis by Senator Vance Hartke. He offered some really introspective metaphysics. He said, "What must we seem to the deep inner selves of ourselves?" Which reminded me of the little item I saw in the Wall Street Journal about the fellow who on the surface was very deep, but down deep was really pretty shallow. And this is, I think you know people like that. Just don't look to the right or left of you. Now, and then the state Democratic chairman also showed Mrs. Malaprop a thing or two when he was asked if he was going to try to get Teddy Kennedy to run for president. He said, "He hasn't made any ovations to me, and I haven't made any ovations to him." Well, enough of this, the lighter touch. The economic problem and the energy crisis is certainly no laughing matter, and we ought to turn our attention now to some of the problems that are crying for attention. Now, just how does the oil crunch in particular worsen the prospects for an inflationary recession this year? And secondly, what tax and budget measures should we be taking to counteract it? Third, what should we be doing to handle the problems of short supplies and runaway prices of oil and gasoline in the short run? And as you know from the reports of the end of the embargo, the lifting of the embargo, I noticed in this morning's Topeka paper that it said that the headline read that it would not resolve either the shortage problem or the price problem, and I'll address myself to that later. But, you know, how do we handle this explosive price problem, particularly in ways that will avoid price gouging of the consumer, that will curb profiteering by producers, that will cut our wasteful, really our hoggish uses of energy, and that will at the same time preserve incentives and stimulate the search for new supplies of energy. And finally, what measures should we be taking in the longer run looking to that objective? Well, now, just a few words before going into the details, just a few words on a couple of underlying assumptions. Number one, the energy shortage, I want to repeat, even with the lifting of the Arab embargo, is for real. It was developing before the oil embargo hit, and it will continue now that the embargo is lifted. I take time to underscore that point because of the enormous skepticism I've run into around the country about the reality of the energy shortage. Time and again I'm asked, isn't it just a conspiracy? Isn't it just something contrived between the oil companies and the Nixon administration? And you can understand why there would be that skepticism when people get much of their information from impeachable sources in the White House. That does lead. Somebody asked me this morning at the press conference, do I feel that energy policy and economic policy are suffering from the Watergate affair? Well, I don't think the management is as such. George Shultz and John Dunlop and Bill Simon have been managing really quite well on economic policy, and all their mistakes are intelligent mistakes. I want to make that perfectly clear. But in other words, the economic management is in competent hands, whether you agree with the policies and the philosophy or not. But when it comes to making appeals to the country from a moral platform, so to speak, there may be some problems of credibility there that are difficult to cope with. Now, even as the Arabs turn on the spigots and end the embargo, the impact of the petroleum price explosion will continue to imperil oil importing economies throughout the world. The ending of the embargo isn't quite the biggest non-event of the year, although did you notice the stock market seemed to think so? It dropped 13 points yesterday. There's an old adage, buy in anticipation of good news and sell on the realization of that news. And the stock market seemed to be following that advice in spades. By the way, I'm not going to talk about the stock market because making forecasts of the stock market requires the skills of not the economic analyst, but the psychoanalyst, and I'm not that. But I do want to share with you Will Rogers' advice on the stock market. He said, don't gamble. Just take all your savings and put them in some good stock, and when it goes up, sell it. And if it don't go up, don't buy it. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. It's the ending of the embargo isn't nearly as big an event as the quadrupling of the price of foreign oil from $2.50 to $10 a barrel in 1 year, a little over a year, and the jump in the price of domestic crude oil from $2.90 to $5.25 in the past 20 months, and $3.50 to $5.25 in the past 12. That's for old oil, which is about 70% of our domestic oil, and a jump from that $2.90 or $3.50 to $10.50 for new oil, which is about 30% of our total supply. There's the rub, and it's the consequences of that that I want to devote most of my attention to in this morning's remarks. By the way, just as part of the factual base, you should know that oil constitutes about half of our total energy source in the United States, and that of that half, 2/3 comes from domestic sources and 1/3 from foreign sources. And of that 1/3, you should understand further that only, a fourth, about 9% of our total oil supply, maybe 10%, comes from the Arab oil countries that have been putting the whammy on us with this oil embargo. And I hope we maintain that kind of perspective in looking at the problem. Now let me look at the 1974 economic prospects as impacted by the oil shortage. First, we should remind ourselves that the economy was already heading into a slowdown before the Arab oil cutoff hit us. The economic slowdown, was consciously engineered by tight money policies at the Federal Reserve, approved by the White House, led to short-term interest rates in the 10, 11, 12% range last summer, and was consciously engineered by White House tight budget policies designed to cool off an overheated economy. So critical as I am of the way that Mr. Nixon and Mr. Nixon's White House handled the agricultural crisis in '72, particularly in terms of the Russian wheat sale, not, mind you, that any other administration would not have sold that wheat to Russia. They would have done it. I doubt that they would have paid out $300 million of subsidy to keep the price at about a quarter of the level it is today, or a third. And critical as I am of the way they've handled the energy crisis. Mr. Nixon has made a number of speeches over the years, but there's been no follow-through in really trying to drive Congress to take some definitive action. So I am critical on both of those scores. I think that the White House in those areas has shown an infinite capacity to be caught by surprise. But having said that, on one hand, on the other hand, the White House deserves good economic marks in the past year for its tough budget policy. Now, I underscore the word economics, the economic adjective, because I happen to have a very different view of what the social judgment or ethical or equity judgment should be of how Mr. Nixon cut back that budget. But I have to divide myself into economist over here and sort of value preference social observer over here. I thought that squeezing down the social service programs the way he did and impounding funds and so forth was very bad social policy. But at the same time, it took a lot of intestinal fortitude to cut that budget down and to run a tight budget policy in a year of an economy that was overheated, that was obviously running into the problem of excess demand, and that, on the purely economic side, Mr. Nixon has to be given good marks for. So, as I say, you always have to think on the one hand and on the other hand. And by the way, when I say that, I can't help recalling that the first chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Ed Nourse, the advisor to Harry Truman, who's now 90, I believe, every former chairman of the council is still living. I don't know whether that proves that it's, the fountain of youth down there, but it is true that we're all still alive. And Ed Nourse thought that the appropriate way to handle that office was to tell the president, Mr. President, on the one hand, there are these factors, and Mr. President, on the other hand, there are those factors, and then not make a recommendation. Leave it to him in his great economic wisdom, Mr. Truman, to make the judgment. Well, you can imagine how Truman went for that. And one day Ed Nourse was in there, and he said, Mr. President, on the one hand, Mr. President, on the other hand, and finally Mr. President slapped the lectern like that, and he said, for God's sakes, give me a one-armed economist. And so I'll try to be a one-armed economist today, but it isn't always easy. Now, enter the oil oligarchs with their embargo and their huge price increases. And what has happened to the economy? Well, instead of an economic slowdown, which most of us were forecasting before the oil cutoff, we really are now what looks to be a recession, or in Mr. Nixon's somewhat more delicate term, a downturn. But a downturn or a recession by any other name smells just as bad. Now, it's a fairly mild downturn, but still it is an actual drop in real output for perhaps this 3 months period, this quarter and the next quarter, and a very sharp rise in unemployment. It's already gone up from 4.6 to 5.2. It held there for a month in terms of percentages. That's behind those percentages lie 650,000 people unemployed who had jobs in October, and there probably will be a further jump of unemployment of about 900,000, maybe 1 million before this thing works itself out. And that's a huge increase in unemployment. And just to show you how bad it is, I understand that the New Jersey Mafia has already laid off 3 judges. Now, that's the sort of index I use for measuring unemployment. Now, when you come to the question of the impact of the oil crisis on this picture, the surprising thing is, and this is where Simon and company deserve credit, the surprising thing is that it isn't the result of a shortage of energy or shortage of oil cutting back on production. That isn't what's happened. That was what people thought at first, that it was going to be from the supply side, that we simply wouldn't have enough energy to, and I mean here energy in the economic sense, we simply wouldn't have enough energy to keep the economy moving up. That is not what has happened, but there has been a surprising impact, it surprised many people, it shouldn't be surprising when you think of the economics of it, on demand. 2 types, what I call demand diverting effects and demand absorbing effects. The demand diverting effects are obvious all around you. Because of the shortage of gasoline and the rising price of gasoline, people have cut down on their purchases of cars. They're down 32% in the last period, and much more important, the standard car purchases are down over 50%. So dollar weighted, the cutback in the automobile industry is horrendous. And people aren't buying campers and boats and tourist services and so forth. So a lot of that demand is diverted. Where does it go? Well, some of it goes to other purchases, but some of it simply goes into savings and is taken off of the consumer market. When you don't buy a car, you don't go right out and buy something else instead. You simply don't take out as much installment debt, and that is algebraically an increase in savings. Now, in spite, in other words, of inflation, we have had a very sharp increase in savings, and that's no mean trick. By the way, I thought I should share with you a sign that was outside of the Holy Nativity Lutheran Church in Minneapolis. It read as follows: Jesus saves, and in these days of inflation, that's a miracle. I thought you'd like that little religious note. That can't be the evangelical Lutheran Church I used to go to. They weren't swingers like that, but anyway. So it isn't so much the shortages as the petroleum price explosion that's killing us economically. That's the demand diverting effect. Now, the more interesting one, and the one that there's less understanding of, is the demand absorbing effect. Now, zooming petroleum prices are absorbing $15 to $20 billion that we might otherwise be spending on other things. I wonder how many are aware that for 20 years, petroleum prices at the refinery went up only 1% a year, from 53 to 73, and then in 73, they jumped 125% in 1 year. Those are spot prices, and if you, that is, the auction prices on the market, and if you knock off, as I do, as, being conservative, as I am, if I knock off 25%, it still makes a pretty brisk comparison. 1% a year for 20 years, 100% in the past year. Now, as that works its way through into consumer prices, that will absorb $15 to $20 billion of your purchasing power and mine and of the 200 million odd people in the country that simply won't reappear in the economy. Why not? Well, most of it goes to the overseas, not most of it, a large chunk of it goes to the overseas oil potentates, and they're not going to increase their imports from us by more than, a very small amount in the short run, and not all that much in the long run. And secondly, it goes to the oil companies, and that isn't going to be reappearing in the economy because A, they're probably skittish about increasing dividends given the political risks, and B, their investment programs for this year are already set, and they'll simply use the cash flow instead of borrowing from the markets. So net, out of that 15 to 20 billion, you can't expect more than 1 or 2 to show back up in the economy. And that is just as if you levied a tax of that amount on the American consumers and squirreled it away in the United States Treasury. And that effect will not be relieved by the ending of the embargo. As a matter of fact, that will be increased. Because as the oil company presidents have been pointing out in the past couple of days, as the larger amount now of that high-priced foreign oil enters our mix, that 1050 oil is against the 525 old domestic oil, that'll raise the prices of gasoline and other products. And I think that's important to recognize that the end of the Arab oil embargo will no doubt increase gross national happiness, but it won't increase gross national product. It may actually have a further demand-absorbing effect on it. Well, now, let me turn back just very quickly to the net effect of last year's tight money and tight budget and this year's tight and expensive energy on the economy. Will it be a recession or a downturn? No question about it. As I've indicated, yes, the economy is sliding into a recession right now. Whether it'll finally be labeled a recession or not is not all that important. Will there be an upturn in the second half of the year as Mr. Nixon has forecast? Now, people look at his forecasts with great, shall we say, skepticism because some of his past economic forecasts and his economic advisors' forecasts have been pretty wide of the mark. Not that the rest of us haven't made our mistakes too. We really did not foresee the severity of inflation in the past year. No matter how close to the mark our forecasts of real growth might have been. I noticed that George Meany had a little fun with the administration last week. He said, they're eternal optimists. He says Herbert Stein, the president's economic advisor, never met an economic statistic he didn't like. And I thought that was kind of cute. And then he said, if the Nixon administration were reporting the sinking of the Titanic, it would read this way: the Titanic has stopped in mid-ocean to take on a supply of ice. And but I can go through that routine only because this time I agree with the president. I think there will be distinctly an upturn in the economy in the second half of the year. After sliding, you can't call the turn, the shots exactly, but automobiles will rebound. The automobile manufacturers say they're going to manufacture 4.8 million little cars in the 1975 model year. Housing, which has taken an awful beating, down from 2.8 million starts to 1.4. That'll start to rebound. Lots of money's going back into the savings and loans, and mortgage rates will taper a little bit. So I expect that to pick up in the second half of the year. And then third, business has never abated its spending on plant, machinery, and equipment. That got started late in the last expansion, was somewhat retarded, and now as more materials become available with the reduction in output of cars and housing and so forth, I think we'll have a real bounce in the building of machinery and plant and equipment the second half of the year, and that'll tend to pull the economy back up. I don't think it'll be quite in time for graduation. I am sorry for you seniors, but later in the year, if you're still unemployed, you'll get jobs. Oh, I suppose everybody at Kansas State gets jobs, so I won't worry about that. The agricultural economy is doing swimmingly. By the way, there isn't the resentment. Have you noticed that? There isn't the resentment of the farm price explosion in terms of the farmers. Nobody talks about a contrived or conspiratorial action on the part of the farmers, and they ought not to. Last year, at long last, they had a big jump in their income. Their median family income moved from 83% of the national average to 93%. But the country doesn't think of the farmer as a profiteer and shouldn't. Now, let me go on to say that profits in general, I know you're not interested in the details, but profits in general will not do too well this year. But even if they go off, leaving aside the oil companies now, if they go off about 10%, remember that profits have zoomed 80% in the past 3 years for the economy as a whole. And even if they go off 10% this year, they'll still be on a very high plateau. Somehow or another, in spite of all the difficulties, companies seem to be doing quite well on profits. And I was reminded of the retrospective the Wall Street Journal had on cartoons by Lorenz, that marvelous cartoonist. And one of them shows a chairman of the board addressing his annual stockholders meeting. And bear with me, it's a long caption, but you'll like it. And here's what he's saying to his stockholders. And though in 1970, as in previous years, your company had to contend with spiraling labor costs, exorbitant interest rates, and unconscionable government interference, management was able once more, through a combination of deceptive marketing practices, false advertising, and price fixing, to show a profit which in all modesty can only be called excessive. Well, that's a bit of a spoof. By the way, on the same page, they show these two conspiratorial old duffers in their club, one of them saying to the other, the computer is only a tool. There will always be a place for unbridled avarice. Thought that might be encouraging to you. Well, so our prospect is for a downturn this part of the year and a comeback in the later part of 1974. Now, what action should we be taking at the national level to cushion the recession and to speed the recovery? Well, it seems to me that, first of all, the Federal Reserve system should be easing up on money. At the moment, they happen to cinch it up a little bit, but I think we're on a sawtooth downward in terms of interest rates and a sawtooth upward in terms of the availability of money. So I think they're playing their role in this easing process. I hope they don't stop too soon. But what's much more interesting, and what I'm going to be discussing with two congressional committees tomorrow morning, the Senate Finance Committee at 9:30 and the Appropriations Committee at 10:30, is what you ought to be doing to stimulate the economy and at the same time, in effect, pay reparations to the groups in the economy that have been taking such a beating from inflation in the past year. Now, my favorite move for doing this is to increase the federal personal income tax exemption from $750 to $850 this year and maybe $900 next year. That would do no more than restore the purchasing power it had at the time it was set at $750. In other words, to make up for inflation. It would cost about $5 billion, and it would inject that much into the economy. Now, socially, I think the case for it is absolutely compelling, because remember that in the past year, inflation has been bitterly tough on the poor and the near poor. Normally, inflation isn't all that tough on the poor. Why? Because the very same things that cause the rise in prices also cause a hiring of the people at the bottom of the barrel, and their jobs increase, their incomes increase, their hours increase. And those benefits, a University of Wisconsin study has shown, exceed their losses from inflation. But not this past year. The food and fuel price explosion has hit them in the solar plexus. The people in this audience might spend, somewhere around 15 to 20% of their net income for food. A study that the Agriculture Department sponsored and was just published 2 days ago shows that a family of four, a couple and two teenage boys, with an annual income of $3,000 spends 83% of its budget on food. Even at $6,000, it spends 42% of its budget on food. Now imagine if you had a family income, 40% of which was going for food, just to take, again, the more conservative number, and food went up 25% as it did in the past 15 months. That is the same thing as if someone had come along with an axe and chopped off 10% of your real income. And I feel we should be doing something to restore that. Now, the first question I will be asked by the senators is, Mr. Heller, isn't that fiscally irresponsible? Doesn't the budget already provide lots of stimulus for 74, 75? Isn't it going to be worsening inflation? And the answer to those questions is no, no, no. The budget by the studies of both liberal and conservative observers is just about a hold-the-line budget. Mr. Nixon himself says it has about the same restraint for 75 that was exercised in 74. And as far as the inflation part is concerned, inflation this year has a life of its own. It's the petroleum price upsurge. It's the food price upsurge. Neither of these has much to do with the overall demand management by fiscal and monetary policy in this country. It's the commodity price explosion apart from food and fuel. Every country in the world boomed in 73, and everybody needed all kinds of commodities, textiles, copper, aluminum, zinc, you name it. And all of them went up to record prices. All the economies of the world are now trying to cool it. They're trying to cool down, and that pressure will be gone. Again, we'll have a one-shot sort of pop-up effect of prices from taking off controls. That'll work itself off. And furthermore, the most serious inflation pressure this year is going to come from cost push, from accelerating wages and declining productivity. None of those have much to do with the injection of a little bit of purchasing power into the economy. And so I think we can take this move, which is socially so imperative, without more than a minuscule effect on the inflation picture, and we can really help the lower income groups, and particularly also the blue-collar worker whose income, whose average weekly earnings in January were worth in purchasing power 4% less than a year earlier. The biggest drop in real income of workers in the 10 years that statistic has been kept. So what I'm talking about is something that would, again, dividing it over here into social and economic categories. Socially, it would be a very constructive move, and economically, it would help cushion the recession and help us move ahead in recovery. Now, in that process, I gave you my essential assessment of what I think is going to happen to inflation. Unlike the Savonarolas of the economics profession, I do not expect inflation to worsen during 1974. It'll be bad this quarter and still next quarter, but you know, a lot of it will burn itself out. These special cases of the oil prices and food prices, I think oil prices will continue to work their way through the system. That explosion will be reflected in rising prices through next summer, and then it'll taper off. You'll have high prices, but that's not inflation. Inflation to an economist, and as generally understood, is rising prices. And I think they will rise less rapidly by the end of the year. In January, consumer prices rose 12%, just to get bold and make a forecast specific. I would think by the end of the year they'd be at 6% annual rate or below. Now that's not nirvana, that's not as low as we'd like them, but I just don't think you in your careers are going to find yourself living with less than 4% average inflation per year. But that's a heck of a lot better than double-digit inflation, 12 or 10% inflation. I hope, by the way, that the government doesn't simply throw away its wage and price controls completely. Oh, it's high time to get rid of mandatory controls. You just can't have that smothering blanket, that straitjacket of controls for any sustained period of time. But it would be too bad not to have the kind of thing that Arthur Burns has been calling for, a wage price review board, with power of surveillance, with guidelines, and with the power here and there. This is just, I'd say, surveillance over big unions, big business, and basic materials, with power occasionally to suspend or actually to roll back a price or wage increase that's particularly flagrant. I think we ought to retain that power. I think it's last year when we made that miserable mistake of junking a successful Phase 2 and went to the fiasco of Phase 3, they kept talking about the club in the closet, but they never took it out. Perhaps for fear of other things that would fall out. But but you have to have a club that you'll occasionally use. So I hope we use that club from time to time. It can be a very powerful one. We have fiscal policy, monetary policy. As of August 15th, 1971, when Mr. Nixon slapped on the wage price freeze, we've had bipartisan, I think, wage price policy, government intervention. Either the threat or the fact of wage price intervention will live with big business and big labor from here on out. And that added a powerful tool. I like to quote one of my heroes of the 30s in this connection, Al Capone. Al Capone used to say you can get so much farther with a kind word and a gun than with a kind word alone. And you can see why I would respect. By the way, I said that at an NAM session that was chaired by Bill Buckley, one of my heroes, of course, too. And here's how it came out in his column. As Heller quoted Capone, people are more persuasive when they have a gun in their hand as well as a carrot. You know, now that, I thought that lost something in the translation. So my 100% faith in Bill Buckley's has been a little eroded. I now want to say, in spite of the fact that time is, I really haven't adhered to quite to my objective. I was going to try to follow the terseness of Chief Justice Murdoch of the U.S. Tax Court some years ago, when a particularly flagrant evader threw himself on the mercy of the court and he said, "As God is my judge, I do not owe this tax." And Murdoch fixed him with an icy stare and he said, "He's not, I am, you do." Well, that's the way I'd like to see my students write exams, but they don't quite do it that way, nor do I quite hold myself down. But let me spend just a couple of minutes before closing on the policies for managing oil that would protect consumers, preserve incentives, and prevent profiteering. Now, we do have to be very circumspect in this. You tend to fall prey to H.L. Mencken's old rule: for every problem there is a solution, simple, neat, and wrong. And that's worth remembering, too, when you write your exams. But but we have the question, it's so easy to jump to the conclusion there are going to be windfall profits, slap on a windfall profits tax or an excess profits tax. And the administration has a windfall profits tax that would raise about $3 billion a year out of the $10 billion of additional profits that the various segments of the oil industry ought to be earning. I just think that's sort of sprinkling a little holy water on those excess profits. I don't think it'll do the job. And a regular excess profits tax is really an exercise in futility. It's a great concept, but try to define those excess profits taxes, those excess profits. Try to find them. And, it's like Gertrude Stein said when she went back to Oakland, her hometown. She said, "When I got there, there was no there." And that's the way it is with the excess profits tax. In the Korean War, by the time all of the special exceptions and deductions had been put in, the excess profits tax on oil companies was yielding peanuts. So my approach would be to roll back, I know this is not very popular in the White House, to roll back the prices not so much of new oil, where you need to preserve incentives, but of old oil. Old oil has jumped, as I say, from $2.90 to $5.25. Roll it back $1. Costs haven't risen anywhere nearly commensurate with those increases in prices. We produce 3 to 3.5 billion barrels of domestic old oil each year. if you rolled it back $1, you'd pick up $3.5 billion of potential excess profits right there. I mean actual excess profits. You'd stop them at the source without all the difficulty of the excess profits tax, and perhaps roll back new oil to about $8 from its present $10 or $11 level. The oil companies tell me that would preserve plenty of incentive for both drilling more oil and developing substitutes. In short, that kind of a program would save consumers about $4 or $5 billion. It would stop at the source $4 or $5 billion of excessive profits. It would, at the same time, by saving consumers those dollars, would reduce that absorption effect of the $15 to $20 billion by $5 billion, and that would help support the economy. And by maintaining a high price for new oil would preserve incentives, which we desperately need, the incentives of the price mechanism. So that is the way I would approach that problem. Now, I would at the same time end those costly tax loopholes in the oil industry. As long as they're getting good prices, as Thornton Bradshaw, the president of Atlantic Richfield, put it, he said, we don't need those tax incentives. We don't need the percentage depletion. I would retain the deduction of intangible drilling and development costs on dry holes. And I say that advisedly here in Kansas. I really think that it's important to let those be deducted, but not on the holes where you hit. So that that kind of a program would combine fairness to the producer and fairness to the consumer. Well, for the longer run, I think the program is obvious. We have to do an awful lot of new drilling. We have to recognize that our imported oil, and particularly the Arab oil, is an interruptible service of energy. We have to develop reserves. I would just as soon have the Defense Department or a TVA-like corporation go into our offshore lands. They all belong to the people, you know. They all belong to the government. And develop maybe 3 billion barrels of oil capacity and just cap them. Also, another proposal, and Bill Simon has made this, why not change the system of leasing? Instead of having these tremendous front-end load costs of the leases, why not just raise the royalties on our oil, the people's oil, from, say, 16% where they now stand to 50%, and take them in oil and get enormous storage facilities so that we can no longer be put over the barrel by the oligarchs of the Arab countries. And I think that makes just an enormous amount of sense, and we ought to do something like that as part of our long-run policy to develop the people's, the resources that belong to the people of this country and use them in such a way not to have a Fortress America absolute independence in our energy sources, to take oil from the other countries if they're willing to sell it to us, but to be in a position to help ourselves and help our allies if an oil crunch is again imposed upon us by our foreign friends in the Arab countries. Well, I've said a lot of controversial things, I'm sure. I want you to know in closing that there's one place where my word is still law. The students will doubt this, and that's in my introductory economics course at the University of Minnesota. I give the lectures once a week on economic policy aspects of macroeconomics to 700 students, and the rest of the week they divide into the sections, and the instructors have them, and they give the exams. And here's what one student wrote. It's a little dog-eared by now because it was written in 1969, but one of the instructors gave me this question and answer. 69, you remember, was a period of inflation and ebullience in the economy, excess demand, and the question he put was, the neoclassical prescription for growth calls for tight monetary policy and tight budget policy. Do you agree? Explain. And the answer was clearly yes. So, of course, the student said no. It has, now listen to this. It has been explained that such things as internal debt aren't harmful to an economy. The old classical ideas aren't invalid. They merely are too broad and all-inclusive to fit today's rapid pace of economic growth. You know, it's polite to call it baloney, and just F-. But look at how this fellow redeemed himself. Anyway, Heller said it was all right, and from my general observations around here, what he says goes. A+.
Following his lecture, Dr. Heller entertained questions from the audience.